Hi everybody, welcome back to CMN 153. This is for our class for Thursday, the 21st. And I wanted to move beyond the introduction to media and popular culture that we had last class to begin to discuss certain elements of media within popular culture. And I'm beginning with advertising because basically advertising and public relations are the glue that holds together all media. It's the one thing that all media share because media needs to be financed in one way or another, and advertising and public relations are ways to go about getting it financed. This will also be the subject of your first journal, which will be due on Tuesday the 27th at 11:59 p.m., so right before midnight. And what I ask is that you write approximately a page or so, but it could be as long or as short as you'd like it to be, about the topic of advertising and public relations based on class video, the class readings, your own understanding of the topic, the discussion forum responses. And basically, I'm not evaluating for grammar or mechanics, just for content. So it's as if we were having a conversation on paper. And again, you can write as long or as little as you'd like, but I think about a page or so is appropriate. And then I review it for content and grade it accordingly on a checkmark system. And a plus would be excellent, a check plus is very good, a check is satisfactory. There's also a less than satisfactory and unsatisfactory, but most of the grades end up in the first three levels. And you'll be doing journals now on for the rest of the semester, but your journals will be due on after the topic that we've discussed. So obviously we're discussing advertising and public relations today, but your journal won't be due until Tuesday, the 27th, so that you have time to also answer the discussion forum question and read your classmates' discussion forum question as well, if you wanted to incorporate that within a journal. And certainly if you need an extension, just ask me and I'll be happy to grant it to you. So I wanted to keep today's class relatively short because there was a video that I wanted to show you that I think is quite important in terms of advertising. But chapter 11, at least in the textbook in which I had, the edition which I had ordered, talks about a definition for advertising: the deliberate calling of attention of products and services with the intent to influence behavior. So usually that's seen as a negative, but it doesn't necessarily always have to be negative. It can be positive as well. Think about the idea of unregulated patent medicines that were very common in the 1800s. Coca-Cola is perhaps one of the most well-known examples where it really had cocaine as part of its ingredients. Ultimately, that led to the FDA, the Federal Drug Association, so that there is some oversight. That's a positive of advertising. Or being able to expose us to new products or ways to stimulate the economy, that's a positive. But it is negative in that we may be influenced to do things or to believe in things that we may not necessarily would do on our own. And that's one of the things that I think is something that we need to examine when we examine advertisements in general. The internet, believe it or not, when it was first created, it was thought that it would be advertising free, that it would serve as a kind of information superhighway for exchange of information among scholars and academics, and we see that it's become just one big playground for advertisers. In fact, it's changed the way that we think of advertising. Email has basically become a repository for spam. And sadly, that's also happening with texting, as I see that oftentimes spammers have found phone numbers that they can text to. Internet data mining. Think about what Mark Zuckerberg started with Facebook, which has become commonplace now, to gather as much information as possible about a user so that ultimately you can sell that to advertisers so they can target their advertising specifically to you as an individual. This is more than just general demographics, things like age or gender or ethnicity. This is right down to you as an individual, which can be wonderful or terrible. At the same time, it can be wonderful because ultimately you are exposed to products that would benefit you, but terrible because of the loss of privacy. video ads. And think about what happened with YouTube. They were very clever in that they basically created a new kind of television, one that didn't rely on networks or major corporations, but ultimately it's become as much of an advertising form as television itself. And then things like the idea of how advertising began, it's as old as time itself, probably, when we think about the town criers, but it began in the 1800s really as an industry. Campbell's Soup was one of the early advertisers. It's a brand that still exists today. And in the 1900s, and even today, in our own times, basically male executives were in charge of the advertisements, targeting to females, thinking that females were the consumers. Again, less so today, but still there is that element. And I think you can see lots of symbols associated with gender because of that in advertising. That's not to say that there aren't other symbols in advertising as well. Advertising is basically, and you can see this in the notes below, the explicit, since I'll be posting the notes for each of the videos beneath the video itself. Advertising is the explicit and implicit cultural storyteller. So basically, there are explicit messages that are clear, by this product. But then there are implicit messages. So imagine if you were, let's say, an alien coming from another planet, and you were to see some of our advertising, and then you would be asked what we value as a society. You'd probably say things like sex and youth. And that's true, because that's the message that we're continually given over and over again in advertising. And yes, advertising reflects our society, but also our society reflects advertising. So it works both ways. Now, an important advertisement that I wanted you to take a couple minutes to watch, and you can see this, that this is in the notes below under the first section, advertising. The Super Bowl 1984 Apple ad. And if you've never seen it, it's a very interesting ad on a number of levels. If you have seen it, I ask you to see it again with a more critical eye, because chances are you weren't looking at it critically. You were looking at it basically either not paying attention to it, because that's usually what we do with advertisements. We try not to pay attention. Or you were viewing it from the perspective of a consumer, that this is the product that they're selling. But they were selling lots of other things in this particular advertisement as well. The 1984 Super Bowl ad was aired once and only once during the 1984 Super Bowl. Now, this was a time when we didn't have internet, and it wasn't likely that many people would have recorded this on their VCRs. Yes, it was the time of VCRs. So they created this sense of mystery associated with this ad. Either you were fortunate enough to have witnessed it because you were watching the Super Bowl at that time, so you're part of the in group, and you could talk about the experience of watching it. Or you're part of the out group. You didn't catch that particular ad, but everybody's talking about it, so you want to know more about it. So what a great way to bring about word of mouth. The exact opposite of what we expect with advertising, which usually works through repetition. Now, this is how we remember things, just by repeating them over and over again. This is how advertising jingles work, for instance. It was also very theatrical at a time period where advertisements weren't that sophisticated. They hired Ridley Scott of Blade Runner fame to film that ad, and it has many of his signature techniques in filming with this kind of blue dystopian background. 1984, the year, was a particularly relevant year because of George Orwell's book 1984 that was written years previously as a futuristic dystopian novel about what the world 1984 might be like, with a big brother, a big government overseeing all, and the loss of individual humanity. So when the year 1984 came about, and I was in my teens during that time, everyone was talking about the book 1984 and the ways that we were similar and different. And if you can see the way that this ad begins, we've got a female who basically throws a hatchet into a screen. The screen is supposed to represent Big Brother. And this idea of female empowerment, you think about the women's rights movement and the force that it was gaining in the 1980s. But do look at the way that the woman was dressed, rather scantily, with a lot of bosom exposed. Again, the idea of using female as sex symbol, which is the implicit message, outside of the explicit message that basically Macintosh, and they didn't even tell you what the product was. So in that respect, it violated a lot of the rules of advertising. That Macintosh was going to change the world with Apple. And of course, at that time, we didn't know what that meant. Now, of course, we know they were talking about the Apple computer, which was the birth and the revolution of personal computing. And ultimately, that also led to the birth and the revolution of the smartphone. Not that we knew any of that in 1984, when we were asking just what the heck is an Apple and what the heck is a Macintosh. So you can, look at this ad and look at the color imagery. There are lots of reds, whites, and blues in there, which are associated, of course, with the American flag. There is this element of subliminal advertising, which is illegal. The idea that you are trying to manipulate a viewer into performing an action or purchasing a product. Probably the best examples were in movie theaters, where there would just be one frame out of the 24 frames per second that would say something like buy popcorn, and that subliminal advertisement would hopefully propel you to yearn and want to buy popcorn. So you can't do that kind of subliminal advertising, but think about product placement and how that works, and the idea in that you are registering that product sometimes for long periods of time and what is supposedly the background of a scene. And then ultimately, that could just as well influence you to want that particular product because you've been viewing it for so long. The association principle, which worked very well with children's advertising in particular, that can be quite manipulative as well. The children want the sugary cereal because it's associated with the cartoon characters. Prescription drug ads I've always found to be fascinating because oftentimes they don't tell you what they are supposed to cure. They just talk about the side effects, the litany of side effects that could occur, and perhaps ways that you can improve your life through taking the drug, but they don't tell you what the issue is as to why you should take the drug. This idea of puffery or deception, which I guess is a gentler way of saying lying. Think about a commercial for, let's say, Campbell's Chicken Soup, where it would have been common to put, when filming the chicken soup, marbles in the bowl of the chicken soup so that the chicken would float to the top, so it would look to be much more hearty than what it really is. And again, that's not necessarily a lie, but it's not necessarily the truth either. And political advertising. And certainly, political advertising probably had its birth with the Nixon and Kennedy debates that happened in the early days of television, when Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy were both running for president. And that debate was telecast both via radio, but also via television. And at the time, not everyone owned a television. So approximately half of the audience watched that debate on television, and the other half heard the debate on the radio. And if you can believe the pollsters, what they found was quite fascinating, that the majority of individuals who heard the debate on the radio said that Richard Nixon was the winner because of the content of his message. But the majority of individuals who watched the debate on television said the exact opposite. John F. Kennedy was the winner of that debate because of his presentation, that he appeared presidential, whatever that means. And John Kennedy, very handsome, and he also had advisors to help him with things like his posture and with his dress. That was not the case with Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon declined makeup. At the time, again, this was the early days of television. Individuals didn't understand the importance of wearing makeup under those lights so you don't look washed out. And then, of course, Kennedy used makeup. So all of these elements, played a role in that. And that was really the beginning about the importance of advertising on a mass media scale. And then we think about how politicians have done that either through television advertisements, or you could even have something like an advertisement during the Obama administration that really read more like a television program in its length. It was close to a half hour, if I'm recollecting correctly. So, in some ways, it was breaking all kinds of barriers and expectations. And then, of course, we know that Twitter became and might again become a vehicle for political advertising. So we see how ultimately mass media has helped politicians become marketers of advertising. In effect, they have a product to sell. So that said, I wanted to also talk about the public relations that was that is linked with advertising. The difference is that public relations is more about deliberately trying to promote a positive image or goodwill, rather than trying to get you to buy a particular product. But of course, both go hand in hand. You're not going to buy a product if you don't have goodwill towards it. And basically, you're trying to influence public sentiment. And the 1980s becomes important again, not just for the 1984 ad, but for 1980s public relations campaign for Tylenol, if you know the painkiller Tylenol. Where in the 1980s, there was a scare associated with Tylenol where an individual was going and poisoning some of the Tylenol products. It hit national news, and basically it led to Tylenol being pulled off of the shelves. And the public relations department for Tylenol had indicated that if they continued to make their product unavailable to the public, they would basically lose their customer base and they would lose their business. And Tylenol did the exact same thing, the exact opposite thing than what they were advised to do by their public relations firm. They said that not only were they going to pull their product, but it would remain pulled until they were able to create packaging that could ensure safety of the product so that it couldn't be tampered with and it couldn't be poisoned. And the Tylenol Corporation was right, whether they did it for the moral reasons and the ethical reasons, or whether they did it for the monetary reasons, or a combination of the two. But all of the packaging that we take for granted for protection of medicinals, for instance, where we've got the cellophane that wraps around a cap, and then when we open up the cap to the pill bottle, we've got the foil that needs to be penetrated. All of that was created by the Tylenol company. And then, of course, everyone else followed suit. So that's supposed to ensure the safety of the products. Because prior to that, you could just open up the cap and you would see the capsules, which is how that individual was poisoning Tylenol bottles across the United States, actually. So you might have heard of P.T. Barnum. He is one of the early developers of public relations, arguing that every person or consumer is a sucker. Used all kinds of outlandish elements to secure newspaper coverage, that all marketing is good marketing, all public relations is good public relations, all advertising is good advertising. Just get your name out there. As an industry, public relations began in the early 1800s, just like advertising. Ivy Lee, though, a female, is responsible. The idea that advertising should be general, not necessarily explicit, but to try to be at least somewhat honest and somewhat direct, but not necessarily completely honest or completely direct. The idea was that crowds don't reason, so they could be influenced by symbols. There is a certain level of truth to that. And the techniques, as they've developed over time, video news releases or other news releases, they're really not news, but they are written and presented in the format of news, so that it seems like there's a certain level of importance. Public service announcements. When you think about companies, for instance, who are trying to do good, think about tobacco companies that give a public service announcement about the dangers of smoking, or alcohol companies that give public service announcements about drinking and driving. And yes, that is for the public good, but that also is to make themselves appear positive so that people want to buy their products. So there is a certain level of deception there as well. Pseudo events where you are putting on an event. It could be a parade, it could be a celebration, and that yes, you're helping the community, cancer walks, things of that nature, but also is to help promote the particular product or the particular business. And all of this is about marketing, the process of anticipating, identifying, and satisfying consumer needs and wants. The anticipating is particularly tough, trying to anticipate what someone needs before they even need it. Now, there is a documentary called The Persuaders about advertising and public relations that actually I'm going to revisit later on in the semester. I'm going to have you watch a couple of clips from it. But you can find it online as well. But one of the things that they talk about is that advertising and public relations is our environment, that really we can't escape advertising and public relations. We're exposed to hundreds, if not thousands, of images each day. And that's got to influence us. And in fact, there is a media studies scholar by the name of Jean Kilbourne, whom you may have heard of before. She's from the Media Education Foundation, and that's out of Northampton. She does scholarship on advertising, specifically the role of advertising and gender, and how gender, female in particular, is portrayed within advertising. She is known for a series of documentaries that she's created called Killing Us Softly, about how advertising and public relations have created and mirrored negative cultural images and attitudes and beliefs and behaviors about women. Now, there are other scholars who do different work. You might have heard of Jackson Katz, where he does similar work, but about men. But at any rate, if you wanted to watch her latest version of Killing Us Softly 4, and that came out in 2010, and of course the conversation is, will she come out with Killing Us Softly 5? Because every decade or so she usually comes out with an update to show how things have changed and yet how things have remained the same. You can access this through the GCC library. Unfortunately, it's not available, or I don't believe it's available online for free because of copyright issues. But you can get it through the GCC library. You need to go onto the Canopy Video Service, which means that you need a GCC library card to access the GCC Canopy streaming video. And I've included in section 3, the marketing section, in our notes below, the link for you to be able to do that. But what I wanted us to watch, instead of Killing Us Softly 4, which is from 2010, is watching Killing Us Softly Then and Now, which came out in 2019. And this was a 40th anniversary panel discussion that was filmed at Smith College, so our neighbor in effect, about her work. And it's a nice overview of the work that she's done over the last couple of years or so, or the last couple of decades or so, or actually the last 4 decades or so. And there is length to it. I was thinking about a couple, that's why I misstated that, because it's approximately 2 hours long. So I'm going to leave you with watching this particular documentary that talks about advertising, media literacy, feminism, and a whole lot more. And you can access this on YouTube, and this is in the 4th section of our notes, so you can see the YouTube link there. And that video will be the basis for our attendance question for our class discussion forum, which will be due Saturday, the 23rd of September at 1 p.m. Though if you need additional time, please let me know and I'll be happy to grant you an extension. What do you think is one of the most interesting points in Killing Us Softly, Then and Now, and why? What do you think is one of the most interesting points of this video that I'm asking you to watch, and why? So I'll leave you to watch the video. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.